Welcome back. It's time to start talking about the people of America. Now that we've gotten the basic geography out of the way, this is where the story part of history comes in. But the story doesn't begin where some would have you think it does. North America didn't get its start at Jamestown. Neither was it discovered when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. This continent's history doesn't even begin with Leif Erikson being the first European to step foot on the continent with his fellow Vikings around the year 1000. Sure, these people discovered the continent for their respective countries, but there were millions of people thriving all over the continent for tens of thousands of years before the first Europeans ever showed up. To put that into perspective for you, Native Americans lived in North America alone more than 10,000 years longer than it's been since Jamestown was founded. That is where our story begins. Before we dive in, let's take a moment to look at our learning targets for today. By the end of this lesson, you should have a basic understanding of who the Native Americans in Virginia were, where the three major language groups lived, and how they adapted to their environment to secure food, clothing, and shelter. So what do you already know about Virginia's first inhabitants? What you know probably has something to do with Disney's Pocahontas, right? Well, even though Disney got some things right, they got a lot wrong. Let's take a moment to talk about a few of those inaccuracies. First, Jamestown and Werowocomoco are both in the Tidewater region, not too far from us. There are no mountains and waterfalls nearby, are there? No. Pocahontas married John Rolfe, not John Smith. And most importantly, she did not save the relationship between the English and the Powhatan, like the movie would have you think. But we'll dive into that a little later on. For now, let's get some background knowledge on the people who were native to the area and how they thrived before the English intervened. Native Americans have been called many things over time: Indians, American Indians, Native Americans, First People, and the list goes on. They are America's indigenous people, which just means that they were the first to inhabit the area. They are the only people who are truly native to this country. Anyone who is not Native American has ancestors who immigrated from other countries at some point, whether that happened in recent generations or as far back as the first colonists. When Christopher Columbus made his trek from Spain, there was much undiscovered land. Now, this doesn't mean that no one lived in those lands, obviously. It just means that people from large, wealthy countries had never been there, and it was not on any maps. Columbus was working for Spain to find a northwest passage from Europe to Asia by ship to improve the speed of trade. When he landed in North America, thinking he'd arrived in the Indies, he wrote that he had found Indians, and that is where that name came from. We know this to be false today, but with the technology and knowledge of the time, it was impossible for him to know that he'd landed on a continent not yet on maps. Over 100 years later, when the English arrived at Jamestown, there were hundreds of tribes living throughout what is now the state of Virginia. For this unit, we're going to focus our attention on three major tribes and language groups. First, in Southwest Virginia and parts of the Piedmont and Tidewater region, were the Cherokee, who spoke Iroquoian. On this map, they are depicted in the purple areas. Moving east, the Monican tribe lived largely in the Piedmont region and spoke Siouan. Lastly, the Powhatan tribes, which you would be most familiar with Pocahontas, were a large group of separate tribes under one leader, and they spoke Algonquian and lived in the Tidewater region. You can remember the tribes in order with the phrase Indians shoot arrows, and the languages with cheesy mashed potatoes. These tribes, while similar in some ways, were also very different in others due to their different environments. Over time, every tribe adapted to the land in which they lived. This is how they survived. Many Cherokee lived in heavily wooded areas, so they made use of the lumber by building tall log stockades to keep the village safe. You can see one depicted in the illustration here. And though they built their walls, trade with other Cherokee tribes was vital to their survival. Women were often in charge of this and other things like planting and harvesting, choosing the tribal chief, and sitting on war councils. In this tribe, women were considered equal to men, which was very progressive, considering women were not equals in European society or even American society for hundreds of years after settlement. Unfortunately, it was the Cherokee people who were forced to walk hundreds of miles to Oklahoma in the 1800s by the Americans who wanted their land. Many died, and it became known as the Trail of Tears. The Monicans, who spoke Siouan, stretched along the James and Rappahannock rivers. Their name, Monican, means earth digger, which was very appropriate. These tribes had a special way of burying their dead. Instead of digging holes underground, they covered bodies in dirt mounds that housed hundreds of people. The picture here shows what it looked like, although all of these mounds in the Piedmont region have been destroyed over the years. Monicans also had access to lots of copper, which was a sign of great wealth and great for trading with other tribes. Lastly, we have the Algonquian-speaking Powhatan tribes. By the late 1500s, between 14 and 20,000 people lived in the Tidewater region. So it's no surprise that this was a great meeting place for many neighboring tribes and a great location to set up homes. It is near the water, so fishing was vital to life in the area, in addition to hunting like other tribes would do. In order to travel, Powhatan people built dugout canoes by burning a hole into a log and scraping the inside out. Many homes also had vegetable gardens like you might see today, and some towns had large community gardens for large-scale growing. Finally, the Powhatan were unique in appearance because their warriors had intricate tattoos and they shaved the right side of their heads to prevent their bow hand from getting tangled in their hair. Now that we've looked at what made them unique, let's look at something that made all of Virginia's tribes similar. One of those things is the food that they planted. Corn, beans, and squash, or the Three Sisters as they are known, were a staple for Native Americans throughout the state. This is because they grew so well together. Corn grew straight and tall, beans curled up around the corn stalk, and squash grew in the shade of the corn and beans. Its leaves spread over the soil, keeping it moist and preventing weeds from growing. The beans gave off lots of nitrogen, which made the soil extra rich for planting the following season. The people also planted sunflowers and ate from wild grapevines, nut trees, and berry bushes. Clothing among the tribes was minimal. While there was some ceremonial garb, which was more colorful, on a daily basis, any clothes that were worn were made of deer hide. However, Virginia is pretty mild, and the people were well adapted. They also made great use of their environments in the way of shelter. Some used logs, some, like in the picture up top, were made of wattle and daub, which just means sticks and dried mud. Others made woven mats and bent them over branches. Some tribes made longer houses to hold more people, and others had small homes for single families. Speaking of adapting to the environment, the people of Virginia knew the land very, very well, and even with a mild climate, there are things that had to be done to make things work. In the spring, Native Americans fished, hunted, and picked berries. When summer arrived, their focus was on planting and growing crops, so that in the fall they could harvest and preserve food for the winter. Once winter arrived, they hunted birds and other small animals they could find, and otherwise lived off of stored food. So how do we know all of these things? After all, there are no history books, there are no recordings of their lives. How can we know hundreds of years later what life was like? We have archaeology. It is the study of material items, also called artifacts, that past people have left behind. Listen to this from Lynn Ripley of the Ripley Family Farm in Gloucester, Virginia. Every time it was low tide, every time it rained, every time the ground was plowed, I would go out and collect everything. She was talking about the artifacts that were discovered on her property, which she learned was Werowocomoco, the center of the Powhatan tribe, after she called a team of archaeologists in. They found arrowheads, beads, pot shards, copper bits, and so much more. These things, along with skeletons, dried seeds, buried buildings, and so much more, have been found and help us to infer what life was like before the United States existed and before there were Europeans around to document things. In our upcoming units, you'll find that it also tells us a lot about the relationship between the Native Americans and the English settlers once they arrived. All right, you know the deal. We've made it to the end again, and I'm going to ask you a few questions. If the answer is yes, or you can answer the questions, you are ready to move on. If not, go back and look at the information in the slides, or ask for help if you find that you need it. Do you understand who the Native Americans in Virginia were? Can you locate the 3 Native American language groups on a map of Virginia? And can you describe how the Native Americans used their environment and the resources around them to secure food, clothing, and shelter? All right, have a great day.